The MiG-17 was closing fast on the massive F-4 Phantom over Hanoi, October 1967. Captain Rick Bellman couldn't believe what he was seeing in his mirrors. This thing was supposed to be obsolete, a relic from the Korean War era, built when Eisenhower was president. Yet here it was, gaining on the most advanced fighter jet in the world like a shark chasing a whale. The North Vietnamese pilot knew exactly what he was doing, forced the American into a turning fight where those fancy long-range missiles became useless metal tubes. Make him sweat, make him panic. Then watch the mighty Phantom fall from the sky like so many others. What happened next would expose the most dangerous assumption in modern warfare, that technology alone wins wars. The missiles that were supposed to revolutionize air combat had become America's greatest weakness. But in the crucible of Vietnamese skies, they would evolve into something far deadlier than anyone imagined. Defense Secretary Robert McNamara stood before the Pentagon's war planners in early 1965, absolutely convinced he was witnessing the future of air combat. The F-4 Phantom II represented everything modern warfare should be: fast, high-tech, and lethal at distances that would make dogfighting obsolete forever. "Gentlemen, the days of aerial combat maneuvering are over," McNamara declared with characteristic confidence. The Phantom would dominate Vietnamese skies without ever needing to see the enemy up close. Why risk pilots in turning battles when you could kill from 20 miles away with heat-seeking sidewinders and radar-guided Sparrows? The philosophy seemed bulletproof on paper. The F-4 could fly twice the speed of sound, climb like a rocket, and carry more missiles than any fighter in history. Its powerful radar could track targets beyond visual range while enemy pilots were still squinting into the distance. This wasn't just technological superiority. It was a complete revolution in how wars would be fought. But there was one problem with this perfect plan. The Phantom had no gun. Air Force and Navy brass had actually debated installing a cannon during development. Traditional fighter pilots argued you always needed a backup when technology failed. The missile advocates won decisively. Guns were dead weight from a bygone era. Why carry a few hundred rounds when you could mount 8 missiles instead? The first F-4s arrived in Vietnam in August 1965, and American pilots got their first reality check immediately. The rules of engagement required visual identification before firing. No shooting at radar contacts from 20 miles away. You had to get close enough to see the enemy aircraft, confirm it was hostile, then try to back away to missile range. The North Vietnamese quickly figured out this weakness. Their MiG-17s and MiG-21s were small, nimble fighters designed for close-in combat. When American pilots tried to extend for missile shots, the Vietnamese closed the distance relentlessly. Suddenly, those sophisticated Phantoms were trapped in knife fights with no knives. Captain John Boyd, the Air Force's premier fighter tactician, watched the early engagements with growing alarm. The Phantom pilots were doing everything by the book, maintaining speed, using altitude advantage, trying to employ their missiles properly. But the Vietnamese weren't reading the same book. The enemy pilots had trained in the Soviet Union under instructors who remembered dogfighting German Messerschmitts over Stalingrad. They knew how to force a larger, faster aircraft into disadvantageous positions. They understood that technology meant nothing if you couldn't bring it to bear effectively. By late 1965, disturbing reports were filtering back to Washington. F-4s were being shot down by aircraft that belonged in museums. American pilots were being captured or killed by enemies' flying fighters designed in the late 1940s. The invincible Phantom was bleeding, and North Vietnamese pilots were starting to laugh. Colonel Toom, the legendary Vietnamese ace, reportedly told his pilots, "The Americans have built a very expensive way to die. We will show them how expensive." The most technologically advanced Air Force in history was being schooled by pilots flying hand-me-downs from the Korean War. The missile revolution wasn't working as advertised, and American air superiority, the foundation of everything from close air support to strategic bombing, was cracking under pressure from an enemy that refused to fight by modern rules. Colonel Nguyen Van Thum wasn't supposed to exist, according to American intelligence reports. The man the Vietnamese called the Red Baron of Hanoi had supposedly been killed 3 different times, yet he kept appearing in debriefings from captured American pilots. They described a master tactician who seemed to anticipate every American move before it happened. The truth was more disturbing than the legend. North Vietnam had assembled an elite cadre of fighter pilots trained not in backwater Asian flight schools, but in the most advanced aerial combat academies the Soviet Union could provide. These men had learned their craft from instructors who'd survived the crucible of the Eastern Front, where German aces like Erich Hartmann had perfected the art of aerial killing. Thum and his fellow pilots understood something American war planners had forgotten. Air combat was still fundamentally about positioning, timing, and exploiting your opponent's weaknesses. The MiG-17 might have been designed in the late 1940s, but it was purpose-built for exactly the kind of close-range combat the Vietnamese intended to force on the Americans. Where the F-4 Phantom was a heavyweight boxer, powerful, fast, devastating at long range, the MiG-17 was a street fighter. It could turn inside the Phantom's radius, accelerate quickly in the lower altitudes where most engagements occurred, and most importantly, it was simple enough that skilled pilots could push it to its absolute limits without worrying about complex systems failures. The MiG-21 added another dimension to Vietnamese tactics. Faster than the MiG-17 and capable of hit-and-run attacks, it could engage American formations, fire a quick burst, then disappear before the Phantoms could respond with their missiles. Vietnamese pilots called this slash and dash, strike fast, strike hard, then vanish into the maze of valleys around Hanoi. But the real secret weapon wasn't the aircraft. It was intelligence. The North Vietnamese had infiltrated every level of South Vietnamese society, from air traffic controllers to base maintenance crews. They knew when American strikes were coming, what routes they would take, and exactly how many aircraft would be involved. This intelligence network allowed Vietnamese controllers to position their fighters perfectly for intercepts. While American pilots thought they were launching surprise attacks, MiG pilots were already climbing to intercept altitudes, positioning themselves between the Americans and their targets. The Vietnamese had also studied American tactical doctrine obsessively. They knew F-4 pilots were trained to maintain speed and altitude, to avoid turning battles, to rely on their missiles for kills. So Vietnamese tactics focused on denying Americans those advantages. Force them low, where the Phantom's engines produced less thrust. Force them into turns where their missiles couldn't track properly. Force them into the kind of combat their training said to avoid. Captain Pham Thanh Nguyen, one of Vietnam's leading aces, later described the strategy. "We made the Americans fight our war, not their war. They wanted to kill from far away with their missiles. We made them come close where our guns could reach them." The psychological warfare was equally sophisticated. Vietnamese pilots would often break off engagements just as American pilots were getting missile lock, forcing the Phantoms to restart their attack runs. This created frustration, burned fuel, and most importantly, gave ground-based surface-to-air missile sites more opportunities to engage the increasingly predictable American formations. Radio intercepts revealed another tactical innovation. Vietnamese pilots coordinated their attacks through ground controllers who could see the entire battlefield on radar. While American pilots relied on their individual aircraft radars with limited range, Vietnamese fighters operated as part of an integrated air defense system that stretched across North Vietnam. The results spoke for themselves. By early 1966, American kill ratios had dropped to barely 2-to-1 against Vietnamese fighters, a catastrophic decline from the 10-to-1 ratios achieved in Korea. The most advanced air force in the world was being systematically outfought by pilots flying aircraft that American museums were already collecting. The secret wasn't superior technology. It was superior thinking. The AIM-7 Sparrow looked impressive on paper, a radar-guided missile that could track and destroy enemy aircraft from distances up to 25 miles. In the sterile environment of California test ranges, it worked beautifully. In the humid, electronically cluttered skies over North Vietnam, it became a very expensive way to miss. Captain Steve Ritchie discovered this the hard way during his first engagement over the Red River Valley in 1967. His F-4's radar had locked onto a MiG-21 at 15 miles. Perfect Sparrow range. He squeezed the trigger, watched the missile streak away, and waited for the explosion that never came. The Sparrow's semi-active radar guidance system had lost track in the ground clutter, sending a $250,000 missile into the jungle below. The problems went deeper than just technical failures. The AIM-7's complex guidance system required the launching aircraft to maintain radar lock throughout the missile's entire flight time. That meant F-4 pilots had to fly straight and level for up to 30 seconds while their missiles tracked toward targets. 30 seconds of vulnerability that experienced Vietnamese pilots exploited ruthlessly. Even worse, the Sparrow's minimum engagement range was about 2 miles. Get closer than that, and the missile couldn't arm its warhead or make the sharp turns necessary to intercept a maneuvering target. Vietnamese pilots had figured this out quickly. Force the Americans inside minimum range, and those sophisticated missiles became dead weight. The AIM-9 Sidewinder had different problems, but equally frustrating results. Early heat-seeking models could only lock onto targets from behind, where jet exhaust provided the strongest infrared signature. But the primitive guidance systems were easily fooled by sun glint-off clouds, ground heat sources, or even the exhaust from the launching aircraft's own wingman. Lieutenant Colonel Robin Olds, commander of the 8th Tactical Fighter Wing, watched his pilots burn through dozens of missiles with minimal results. "We were shooting million-dollar missiles at $1,000 targets and missing," he later recalled. "The Vietnamese were laughing at us, and they had every right to." The rules of engagement made everything worse. Visual identification requirements meant F-4 pilots had to close within a few miles of enemy aircraft before firing, exactly the range where Vietnamese fighters were most dangerous. American pilots found themselves in an impossible situation, too close for missiles to work effectively, but forbidden from carrying guns to fight at close range. Technical reliability plagued both missile systems. The humid tropical environment played havoc with electronic components designed for temperate climates. Moisture seeped into guidance systems, corroded electrical connections, and caused random failures at the worst possible moments. Maintenance crews reported missile failure rates approaching 50% on some missions. The psychological impact was devastating. American pilots had trained extensively with these weapons, building their entire tactical doctrine around missile engagements. When the missiles failed repeatedly, pilot confidence collapsed. Many began to doubt not just their weapons, but their training, their tactics, and their ability to survive in combat. Captain John Boyd's post-mission debriefs revealed the scope of the problem. F-4 crews were firing an average of 3 missiles per kill, when they achieved kills at all. In many engagements, American pilots expended their entire missile load without downing a single enemy aircraft, then had to flee when Vietnamese fighters closed for gun attacks. The North Vietnamese capitalized on American missile failures with devastating effectiveness. Their pilots learned to recognize the telltale signs of missile launches, then execute violent evasive maneuvers that broke radar locks or confused heat seekers. They'd force Americans to fire at maximum range where accuracy was poorest, then close rapidly while the Phantoms were defenseless. Intelligence reports from captured Vietnamese pilots revealed their contempt for American missile technology. One MiG-17 pilot reportedly told his interrogators, "Your missiles are like throwing rocks at birds, very expensive rocks that usually miss." By late 1967, kill ratios had dropped below 2-1, barely better than even odds. The missile revolution that was supposed to give America overwhelming air superiority had instead created the most evenly matched air war since World War II. Something had to change, or the United States would lose control of Vietnamese skies entirely. August 11, 1967. The Paul Doumer Bridge stretched across the Red River like a steel lifeline, feeding North Vietnam's war machine. For months, American planners had watched supply trains cross that span, carrying Soviet missiles and Chinese ammunition south toward the battlefields. Today, 16 F-4 Phantoms from the 8th Tactical Fighter Wing would finally cut that lifeline. Colonel Robin Olds briefed his pilots in the pre-dawn darkness at Ubon Royal Thai Air Force Base. Intelligence reports showed light MiG activity around Hanoi, maybe 4 or 5 fighters that could be quickly overwhelmed by superior numbers. The bridge strike would be textbook, high-speed ingress, precision bombing, then home for breakfast. What could go wrong? Everything. Unknown to American intelligence, Colonel Toom had positioned 24 MiG-21s at 3 different airfields around Hanoi. Vietnamese radar operators had been tracking the American formation since it left Thai airspace, calculating intercept courses and positioning fighters for a coordinated ambush. The 16 Phantoms weren't hunting a handful of defenders. They were flying into the largest aerial trap of the Vietnam War. Captain Rick Bellman was leading the second flight of F-4s when his radar warning receiver started screaming. Multiple SAM sites had locked onto his formation, but that was expected over Hanoi. What wasn't expected was his wingman's urgent radio call. "Bandits! Bandits! 11 o'clock high! Jesus, there's a whole squadron of them!" The MiG-21s came diving out of the sun like silver arrows, their delta wings glinting as they rolled into attack positions. Vietnamese pilots had timed their intercept perfectly, catching the heavily loaded Phantoms at the moment they were most vulnerable, committed to their bombing runs with no room to maneuver. Flight leader Major Bob Lodge tried to coordinate his formation's response, but the radio frequencies erupted into chaos. Missile lock warnings, SAM alerts, and frantic position calls created an electronic cacophony that drowned out tactical coordination. Individual pilots found themselves fighting for their lives with no idea where their wingmen were or what the larger battle looked like. Captain Paul Gilmore felt his F-4 shudder as a Vietnamese Adel missile exploded just behind his left engine. Warning lights flooded his cockpit. Fire, hydraulic failure, electrical system damage. His weapons systems officer, Lieutenant J.J. Carroll, was already reaching for the ejection handles when Gilmore saw 2 more MiGs positioning for finishing shots. "Eject! Eject! Eject!" Gilmore screamed, but Carroll was already gone, his ejection seat blasting him clear of the disintegrating Phantom. Gilmore followed seconds later, his parachute deploying just as his aircraft exploded in a fireball that lit up the morning sky over Hanoi. The aerial battle raged for 7 minutes that felt like hours. F-4s tried desperately to bring their missiles to bear, but the Vietnamese fighters were already inside minimum engagement range, forcing turning battles where the Phantom's size and weight became fatal disadvantages. American pilots found themselves flying the kind of combat their training said was impossible, dogfighting without guns against opponents who lived for close-range maneuvering. Major Lodge managed to fire 2 Sparrow missiles at a MiG-21, watching both streak past their target as the Vietnamese pilot pulled into a vertical climb that broke the radar lock. Before Lodge could reposition for another shot, cannon fire from a second MiG stitched across his Phantom's wing route. Fuel began streaming from ruptured tanks, and Lodge knew he had maybe minutes before his engines flamed out. The retreat was as chaotic as the attack. Surviving F-4s limped toward the Thai border with Vietnamese fighters pursuing until they reached the edge of their fuel limits. 3 Phantoms had been shot down, 6 crew members were dead or captured, and the Paul Doumer Bridge remained untouched. The most advanced fighters in the world had been savaged by aircraft designed when Harry Truman was president. Back at Ubon, the debriefing was brutal. Pilots who had trained for years to exploit American technological superiority found themselves describing a battle where technology had meant nothing. The Vietnamese had used superior tactics, better coordination, and intimate knowledge of local conditions to turn American advantages into vulnerabilities. Colonel Toom's post-battle assessment was characteristically blunt. "The invincible Phantom bleeds just like any other aircraft. Today we prove that courage and skill matter more than fancy electronics. North Vietnamese radio broadcasts celebrated the victory for days, playing recordings of American pilots' panicked radio calls and describing the smoking wreckage of billion-dollar fighters. The message was clear. American air superiority was a myth. The secure conference room in the Pentagon's E-Ring had never felt smaller. Defense Secretary Robert McNamara sat at the head of the polished table, staring at casualty reports that made his stomach turn. In 6 months, the F-4 Phantom, his technological masterpiece, had gone from invincible air superiority fighter to expensive target practice for North Vietnamese pilots. General John McConnell, Air Force Chief of Staff, didn't mince words. "Mr. Secretary, we're losing the air war. Our kill ratio has dropped to 1.8 to 1 against the MiGs. In Korea, we maintain 10 to 1. At this rate, we'll have pilot shortages within a year." The numbers were devastating, but the political implications were worse. Senator Stuart Symington, chairman of the Armed Services Committee, had been asking pointed questions about F-4 effectiveness. Congressional hearings were inevitable, and McNamara knew exactly what those hearings would reveal. The most expensive fighter program in American history was failing against obsolete Soviet hand-me-downs. Admiral Thomas Moorer represented Navy interests, and his frustration was palpable. "We told you this would happen. You can't fight a gun battle with a knife, and you can't fight a dogfight without a gun. Our pilots are dying because some Pentagon analyst decided cannons were obsolete." McNamara's face flushed red. The missile-only philosophy had been his personal crusade, backed by the best systems analysts' money could buy. Computer models had proven beyond doubt that future air combat would occur at beyond visual range. The models hadn't accounted for rules of engagement that forced visual identification or for an enemy clever enough to exploit American technological blind spots. CIA Director Richard Helms dropped another bombshell. "Our intelligence indicates North Vietnamese pilot morale is at an all-time high. They're calling the F-4 the aluminum overcast, big, loud, and easy to shoot down. Worse, they're sharing tactics with Soviet advisors who are already incorporating lessons learned into training programs for other client states." The strategic implications were staggering. If the Soviets could neutralize American air superiority with 1950s technology and superior tactics, what did that mean for NATO defense plans? What about the Middle East, where Soviet-supplied Arab air forces were already studying Vietnamese successes? General William Momyer, commander of 7th Air Force, had flown to Washington specifically for this meeting. His pilots were the ones dying over North Vietnam, and his anger was barely controlled. "We need guns on those aircraft, and we need them now. The Su-16 gun pod program should be accelerated immediately. And we need better missiles. The Sparrow failure rate is approaching 60% in combat conditions." McNamara knew the gun pod solution was a band-aid. External gun mounts created drag, reduced fuel capacity, and took up weapon stations that could carry missiles. But the alternative, admitting the entire F-4 design philosophy was flawed, would mean congressional investigations, budget cuts, and the end of his political career. The meeting stretched past midnight as generals and admirals presented increasingly desperate solutions: improved pilot training, better maintenance procedures, modified tactics, anything to avoid admitting that American technological superiority was a myth punctured by Vietnamese pilots flying museum pieces. But buried in the classified reports was a more disturbing truth. The North Vietnamese weren't just winning individual battles. They were forcing a fundamental reassessment of how air wars would be fought. Every F-4 shot down was proof that human skill and tactical innovation could overcome raw technological advantage. McNamara finally spoke the words everyone dreaded hearing. "Fix this. I don't care what it costs or how long it takes. Find a way to make the Phantom work, or find something that will." The most powerful military in history had just admitted it was being outfought by rice farmers in hand-me-down jets. The missile revolution was dead. The question now was whether American air power could survive its resurrection. Colonel Robin Olds stared at the intelligence photos spread across his desk at Ubon Royal Thai Air Force Base, his jaw set in the kind of determination that had made him a legend among fighter pilots. The images showed MiG-21s lined up at Phuc Yen Airfield, like silver daggers waiting to draw American blood. For months, those fighters had been tearing apart his F-4 formations with impunity. Tonight, he was going to turn the tables. The plan forming in Olds' mind was audacious beyond anything attempted in Vietnam. Instead of reacting to North Vietnamese tactics, he would anticipate them. Instead of falling into their traps, he would set one of his own. The enemy's greatest strength, their intimate knowledge of American strike patterns, would become their fatal weakness. "Gentlemen, we're going to make the Vietnamese think Christmas came early," Olds announced to his squadron commanders during the classified briefing. The room fell silent as he outlined Operation Bolo, a deception so elegant in its simplicity that it took everyone's breath away. The North Vietnamese had been studying American tactics for 2 years. They knew exactly how F-105 Thunder Chief bombing formations approached their targets: altitude, speed, radio frequencies, even the specific routes used to avoid the heaviest SAM concentrations. Vietnamese radar operators could identify F-105 strikes from 50 miles away, giving MiG pilots perfect positioning for intercepts. But what if those radar signatures belonged to F-4 Phantoms instead of F-105 bombers? Olds had been analyzing every successful MiG intercept, looking for patterns the enemy might be exploiting. The breakthrough came when he realized Vietnamese controllers were using American predictability against them. F-105s always flew the same profiles, used the same radio procedures, approached targets from the same directions. It was textbook tactical doctrine, and it was getting American pilots killed. Operation Bolo would flip the script entirely. F-4 Phantoms would mimic F-105 flight profiles so precisely that North Vietnamese radar operators would see exactly what they expected to see: a juicy bombing formation ripe for interception. The MiGs would scramble for what they thought were easy bomber kills, only to find themselves facing air-to-air fighters loaded with the latest missiles. The technical details required obsessive precision. F-4s would have to fly at F-105 speeds and altitudes, match their radar signatures by carrying external fuel tanks, and use identical radio frequencies and call signs. Even their approach routes would follow established F-105 patterns down to the minute. Captain John Stone, Olds' operations officer, raised the obvious concern. "Sir, if we're flying F-105 profiles, we'll be sitting ducks for SAMs. Those missile sites know exactly where to expect us." Olds smiled grimly. "That's why we're going to hit them on a day when the weather's so bad the SAMs can't see us, but radar-guided MiGs can still intercept." He'd been studying meteorological reports for weeks, waiting for the perfect combination of low clouds that would blind surface-to-air missiles while leaving enough visibility for air-to-air combat. The intelligence preparation was exhaustive. American signals intercept stations had been monitoring North Vietnamese radio traffic, mapping exactly how enemy controllers coordinated MiG intercepts. The timing had to be perfect. Too early, and the MiGs wouldn't take the bait. Too late, and weather conditions would deteriorate beyond acceptable limits. Weather delays stretched everyone's nerves to the breaking point. December 1966 brought one storm system after another, each promising the conditions Olds needed, but delivering either too much cloud cover or too little. Every postponement gave the North Vietnamese more time to detect patterns in American planning, more opportunities to position their own surprises. Meanwhile, Olds drilled his pilots relentlessly on the deception procedures. Flying F-105 profiles felt unnatural to F-4 crews trained for high-speed, high-altitude intercepts. The Phantoms would be vulnerable during the approach phase, committed to maintaining the illusion until the last possible moment. Finally, on January 1967, the weather forecast showed promise. A cold front moving across North Vietnam would bring the exact cloud conditions Bolo required. Olds gathered his pilots for the final briefing, knowing that tomorrow would either vindicate months of planning or end in catastrophic failure. "Tomorrow, we stop being victims," he told them. "Tomorrow, we become hunters." January 2, 1967, 0600 hours. Colonel Robin Olds strapped into his F-4 Phantom at Ubon Royal Thai Air Force Base, knowing that the next 2 hours would either vindicate months of meticulous planning or end in spectacular failure. The weather was perfect. Thick clouds blanketing North Vietnam at 4,000 feet, with clear air above for the kind of high-altitude combat where F-4s held every advantage. 14 Phantoms taxied toward the runway in formations that looked exactly like F-105 Thunderchief bombing packages. External fuel tanks hung from their pylons, mimicking the radar signature of bomb-laden strike aircraft. Radio call signs matched established F-105 procedures down to the last detail. Even their takeoff intervals followed standard bomber protocols. The deception began the moment they crossed into North Vietnamese airspace. Olds' formation flew at 14,000 feet, exactly the altitude F-105s used to avoid the worst SAM concentrations while maintaining bombing accuracy. Their speed held steady at 480 knots, matching the cruise performance of heavily loaded Thunderchiefs. To North Vietnamese radar operators, this looked like another routine bombing mission heading for the rail yards around Hanoi. At Phuc Yen Airfield, 40 miles northwest of Hanoi, MiG-21 pilots were already strapping into their cockpits. The morning intelligence briefing had been routine. American bombers inbound, probably targeting the Paul Doomer Bridge again. Easy intercepts, quick kills, then home for lunch. Colonel Toom himself was leading the first flight, confident that another batch of American pilots would soon be decorating Hanoi prison cells. North Vietnamese ground control was tracking the American formation with practiced efficiency. Multiple contacts bearing Euro 90, Angels 14, Speed 480. Assesses F-105 strike package, approximately 16 aircraft. The radar signature was perfect, exactly what they'd seen hundreds of times before, but something felt different to the experienced Vietnamese controllers. The formation was tighter than usual, more disciplined. F-105 pilots, focused on their bombing mission, typically flew looser formations to avoid mid-air collisions. These aircraft were maintaining the kind of precise spacing that suggested air-to-air fighters, not ground-attack bombers. The first MiG-21s lifted off from Phuc Yen at 7:15, climbing rapidly toward intercept altitude. Vietnamese pilots were supremely confident. They'd been shooting down F-105s for 2 years with monotonous regularity. The American bombers were predictable, their escort fighters were ineffective, and the kill ratios spoke for themselves. Olds monitored North Vietnamese radio frequencies through his electronic warfare officer, listening to the enemy coordination that would soon become confusion. Vietnamese controllers were positioning their fighters perfectly for a classic intercept, exactly what Operation Bolo required. The trap was set. Now he just had to spring it at the right moment. At SU 7:30, the moment of truth arrived. Olds' formation reached the initial point where F-105s would normally begin their bombing runs. Instead, the Phantoms jettisoned their external fuel tanks and pulled into a climbing turn that no heavily loaded bomber could possibly execute. The deception was over. The hunt had begun. "This is Olds," he radioed to his formation. "We've got MiGs coming up fast. Jettison tanks and prepare for air-to-air engagement. Today, we're the hunters, not the hunted." The North Vietnamese pilots realized their mistake within seconds, but it was already too late. They'd climbed to intercept altitude expecting to find slow, vulnerable bombers. Instead, they found themselves facing air superiority fighters positioned for the kind of beyond visual range combat where American technology held every advantage. Vietnamese radio frequencies erupted into frantic warnings as controllers tried to vector their fighters away from the trap. But the MiG-21s were already committed to their intercept courses, climbing through the altitude band where F-4 missiles were most effective. The hunters had become the hunted in the span of 30 seconds. Colonel Toombs' voice cut through the radio chatter with characteristic calm. "All flights, this is a trap. American fighters, not bombers. Engage at will, but watch for missile shots." Even in the moment of tactical disaster, the Vietnamese ace was analyzing the situation, looking for ways to turn American advantages against them. But this time, the Americans had thought 3 moves ahead. The aerial combat erupted at 20,000 feet over the Red River Valley like a 3-dimensional chess match played at supersonic speeds. Colonel Robin Olds locked his radar onto the lead MiG-21, watching the Sidewinder's seeker head track the enemy's heat signature with deadly precision. This was the moment 2 years of planning had built toward. American fighters finally holding every tactical advantage. "Fox 2!" Olds called as his AIM-9 streaked away from the Phantom's wing rail. The missile's infrared seeker had found the MiG's jet exhaust in the clear air above the cloud deck, tracking with the kind of reliability that had been promised but never delivered in the chaotic, low-altitude battles over Hanoi. Colonel Toombs' fighter disappeared in a brilliant fireball that lit up the morning sky like a second sun. But the Vietnamese weren't finished. Even caught in the perfect trap, their pilots demonstrated the kind of tactical innovation that had made them so dangerous. Captain Pham Thanh Nguyen rolled his MiG-21 inverted and pulled through the vertical, using the fighter's superior instantaneous turn rate to spoil an American missile shot. His wingmen followed immediately, the 2 aircraft weaving through the formation of phantoms like silver needles threading deadly fabric. The radio frequencies exploded with position calls and missile warnings as 14 separate dogfights erupted simultaneously across 50 square miles of Vietnamese airspace. "Bandit, 2 o'clock high. Missile in the air. Where's my wingman?" The carefully orchestrated trap had dissolved into individual battles where survival depended on split-second decisions and absolute situational awareness. Captain John Stone found himself in a turning fight with a MiG-21 that seemed to defy physics. The Vietnamese pilot was pulling his fighter through maneuvers that should have caused structural failure, using every ounce of the aircraft's performance envelope to avoid the Sparrow missiles tracking toward him. Stone's radar lock kept breaking as the MiG disappeared into ground clutter, then reappeared at impossible angles. The key difference was altitude. For once, American pilots were fighting at the heights where their aircraft performed best, where the F-4's powerful engines could generate maximum thrust, and where the thin air allowed missiles to maneuver more effectively. The Vietnamese fighters, optimized for the thick air at lower altitudes, found themselves struggling to maintain energy in the rarefied atmosphere above 18,000 feet. Major Bob Lodge executed a perfect intercept on a MiG-21 attempting to escape toward the Chinese border. His Sidewinder tracked flawlessly in the cold, clear air, the missile's guidance system unconfused by ground heat sources or atmospheric interference. The Vietnamese fighter exploded in a cascade of burning fuel and twisted metal that tumbled toward the jungle canopy far below. Vietnamese ground controllers were screaming warnings and vectors, trying desperately to coordinate their scattered fighters into some kind of defensive formation. But the careful positioning that had made their ambush tactics so effective was now working against them. MiG pilots found themselves isolated, facing multiple American fighters with no mutual support and rapidly diminishing fuel. Captain Fred Olmsted watched his Sparrow missile track a MiG-21 through a gentle turn, the radar-guided weapon adjusting its course with mechanical precision. At this altitude, with clear line of sight to the target, the Sparrow performed exactly as designed. The Vietnamese fighter simply disintegrated under the missile's 88-pound warhead, proving that American technology could be devastating when employed under proper conditions. The battle lasted exactly 7 minutes from first missile launch to final disengagement. When the smoke cleared, 7 MiG-21s had been destroyed without a single American loss. The most lopsided aerial victory since World War II had been achieved not through superior technology alone, but through superior thinking applied to technological advantages. Colonel Toombs' voice came over the radio one final time, transmitted from his parachute as he descended toward the jungle canopy. Well played, Americans. Today, you remembered how to hunt. Even in defeat, the Vietnamese ace recognized tactical excellence when he saw it. The students had finally taught their teachers a lesson. The surviving MiGs fled toward Chinese airspace, their pilots shaken by an encounter that had reversed 2 years of tactical dominance. For the first time since arriving in Vietnam, F-4 crews felt like they were flying the superior fighter aircraft instead of expensive targets. Operation Bolo had proven that American air power could still be decisive when properly applied. The smoking wreckage of 7 MiG-21s scattered across North Vietnam told a story that neither side could ignore. Operation Bolo had shattered 2 years of tactical assumptions in 7 minutes of perfectly executed air combat. But victory carried its own dangers. Overconfidence had already cost America dearly in Vietnamese skies. Within hours of the engagement, North Vietnamese Air Force commanders were conducting brutal post-mission analyses. The loss of 7 fighters and 6 pilots in a single engagement represented the worst defeat since American involvement began. More disturbing was how completely they'd been outmaneuvered by an enemy they'd grown accustomed to defeating. Colonel Toombs, rescued from the jungle after his parachute landing, delivered a sobering assessment to his superiors. The Americans finally remembered they were flying fighters, not flying computers. They used our own tactics against us: deception, positioning, and superior coordination. We cannot allow this to happen again. The Vietnamese response was characteristically adaptive. Within weeks, new standing orders prohibited MiG formations from responding to single radar contacts without visual confirmation. Ground controllers received enhanced training in recognizing American deception tactics. Most importantly, Vietnamese pilots began practicing high-altitude combat scenarios they'd previously ignored. But the North Vietnamese had another card to play: sanctuary. Their surviving fighters retreated to airfields in China and North Korea beyond the reach of American pursuit. This forced American planners to accept a frustrating reality. Tactical victories meant nothing if the enemy could simply withdraw, regroup, and return when conditions favored them again. For American pilots, Bolo's success created its own psychological challenges. After months of feeling like victims, F-4 crews suddenly believed their aircraft was invincible again. Colonel Olds recognized the danger, immediately warning his pilots that overconfidence killed more fighter pilots than enemy action. The technical lessons were equally important. Operation Bolo had proven that American missiles could be devastatingly effective under proper conditions: high altitude, clear weather, and beyond visual range engagements where F-4 advantages were maximized. The key was creating those conditions instead of accepting whatever tactical situation the enemy imposed. Missile reliability improved dramatically when employed within design parameters. The AIM-9D Sidewinder, with its improved seeker head and better low-temperature performance, achieved an 80% kill probability during Bolo. The AIM-7E Sparrow, freed from the electronic interference and ground clutter that plagued low-altitude engagements, performed exactly as advertised. Pentagon analysts seized on Bolo's success as vindication of the missile-only philosophy, but experienced pilots knew better. The operation had succeeded because it forced air combat into the specific conditions where missiles worked best. Change those conditions, and the technological balance could shift again just as dramatically. Training programs began incorporating Bolo's tactical innovations immediately. The concept of using enemy predictability as a weapon became standard doctrine. American pilots learned to study North Vietnamese patterns with the same obsessive attention their opponents had applied to American tactics. But the most important lesson was philosophical. Technology alone never won wars. It was how that technology was employed that determined victory or defeat. The F-4 Phantom remained exactly the same aircraft after Bolo as before. What changed was how American pilots used its capabilities within the constraints of actual combat conditions. Both sides understood that Bolo represented a temporary shift in tactical balance, not a permanent solution. The North Vietnamese would adapt their methods, develop new countermeasures, and return to challenge American air superiority. The air war over Vietnam had become an ongoing laboratory where each engagement taught lessons that shaped the next encounter. The revolution in air combat was far from over. It was just getting started. The Su-16 gun pod looked like an awkward afterthought bolted to the F-4 Phantom's centerline pylon, a 1,200-pound admission that the missile revolution had failed. Inside its fiberglass housing, a 6-barrel M61 Vulcan cannon waited to deliver the kind of close-range firepower that Pentagon analysts had declared obsolete just 3 years earlier. Captain Steve Ritchie watched maintenance crews install the gun pod on his Phantom at Ubon, feeling a mixture of relief and frustration. "Finally, we can fight when the missiles don't work," he told his weapons systems officer. But both men knew this solution came with its own set of problems that would make their dangerous job even more complicated. The Su-16 wasn't designed for the F-4. It was a hasty modification of pods originally built for ground attack aircraft. The installation created immediate aerodynamic issues that degraded the Phantom's performance across the board. Maximum speed dropped by nearly 100 knots with the pod attached. Fuel consumption increased dramatically. Most critically, the gun pod's weight and drag reduced the aircraft's already marginal maneuverability in the turning fights Vietnamese pilots loved to force. Accuracy was another nightmare. The gun pod mounted below the aircraft's center line, several feet away from the pilot's line of sight. This offset created parallax errors that made precise aiming nearly impossible, especially in the dynamic geometry of air combat. Pilots had to learn entirely new gunnery techniques, compensating for bullet trajectories that curved away from their natural sight picture. The vibration was worse than anyone anticipated. When the M61 cannon fired its 6,000 rounds per minute, the entire aircraft shook like a paint mixer. Cockpit instruments became unreadable. Radio communications turned into static-filled gibberish. Most disturbingly, the vibration sometimes caused other systems to malfunction. Hydraulic lines loosened, electrical connections failed, and missile guidance systems lost their calibration. Major Bob Lodge discovered another problem during his first gun pod mission over North Vietnam. The 20mm ammunition load was limited to just 1,200 rounds, about 12 seconds of firing time at maximum rate. In the heat of combat, pilots could exhaust their entire ammunition supply in a single burst, leaving them defenseless if they missed their target or faced multiple enemies. The gun pod also created new tactical dilemmas. Carrying the Su-16 meant giving up a missile station, reducing the F-4's beyond visual range capability in exchange for close-range firepower. Pilots had to choose their weapon loadout based on the type of mission they expected to fly, but Vietnamese tactics made those expectations meaningless. Despite these limitations, American pilots embraced the gun pod with desperate enthusiasm. Captain John Boyd, observing combat results from his Pentagon office, noted the immediate psychological impact. "Our pilots finally felt like they had a fighting chance in close combat." Confidence matters more than perfect accuracy when you're trying to survive. The first gun pod kills came within weeks of deployment. Captain Lawrence Glynn engaged a MiG-17 that had forced him into a turning fight where missiles were useless. His 20mm cannon fire walked across the Vietnamese fighter's wing route, severing control cables and sending the aircraft tumbling toward the jungle below. For the first time in months, an American pilot had won a dogfight on equal terms, but the gun pod was clearly a band-aid solution to a fundamental design flaw. Air Force engineers were already working on the F-4E variant, which would mount an internal M61 cannon in the aircraft's nose. The new installation would eliminate the drag penalties, accuracy problems, and vibration issues that plagued the external pod. Vietnamese pilots adapted quickly to the new threat, They'd grown accustomed to American fighters that became helpless once their missiles were expended. Now they faced opponents who remained dangerous throughout the engagement, forcing tactical adjustments that reduced their own effectiveness. The philosophical shift was more important than the tactical one. American air power had finally abandoned the fantasy that technology could eliminate the human element from warfare. Missiles remained primary weapons, but guns provided the backup capability that combat had proven essential. The lesson would reshape fighter design for the next 50 years. May 8, 1972. President Nixon's voice crackled through secure communication channels to 7th Air Force headquarters in Thailand, delivering the order that would define the final phase of America's air war over Vietnam. Operation Linebacker would unleash the full fury of American air power against North Vietnam's industrial heartland, but this time the rules had changed completely. For the first time since 1968, American bombers could strike targets in the heavily defended Hanoi-Haiphong corridor. The political restrictions that had protected North Vietnamese sanctuaries were lifted. Most importantly, F-4 Phantom crews would be flying with 4 years of hard-won tactical experience and significantly improved weapon systems. The North Vietnamese weren't the same enemy either. Their air force had been rebuilt with advanced MiG-21BI's fighters and a new generation of pilots trained specifically to counter American tactics. Surface-to-air missile sites ringed every major target with overlapping fields of fire. The skies over North Vietnam had become the most heavily defended airspace in military history. Colonel Steve Ritchie, now an experienced combat veteran, briefed his pilots at Udorn Royal Thai Air Force Base with a kind of tactical sophistication that had been unimaginable during the early years of the war. The enemy knows we're coming, they know our capabilities, and they've had 4 years to prepare. But we know their capabilities too, and we've learned how to use ours properly. The F-4E Phantoms taking off for linebacker missions carried internal M61 cannons, eliminating the drag and accuracy problems of the old gun pods. More importantly, they mounted the latest AIM-9J sidewinders with improved all-aspect capability and AIM-7F Sparrows with solid-state electronics that functioned reliably in tropical conditions. The missile systems that had failed so spectacularly in 1965 had finally matured into effective weapons. Linebacker tactics reflected years of painful education in Vietnamese skies. No more predictable flight patterns that enemy controllers could anticipate. No more rigid formations that limited tactical flexibility. American strike packages now employed sophisticated electronic warfare, varied approach routes, and integrated air-to-air and air-to-ground coordination that kept Vietnamese defenders constantly off balance. The first major engagement came on May 10th, when 48 F-4s escorted bombing formations toward the Paul Doumer Bridge, the same target that had cost so many American lives 5 years earlier. This time, Vietnamese MiG-21s found themselves facing fighters that could engage effectively at any altitude, any range, any tactical situation. Captain Richard Ritchie's radar warning receiver detected the MiG formation climbing from Gia Lam Airfield while they were still 30 miles away. Instead of being forced into reactive tactics, his flight positioned themselves for a classic beyond visual range intercept. The improved AIM-7F Sparrow missiles tracked flawlessly in the clear air above the monsoon clouds, destroying 3 Vietnamese fighters before they could close to gun range. The technological balance had shifted decisively. Vietnamese pilots who had grown accustomed to forcing Americans into disadvantageous close-range combat now faced opponents who could kill effectively at any distance. The MiG-21's superior turning performance meant nothing against missiles that could track targets through violent evasive maneuvers. But the North Vietnamese adapted with characteristic ingenuity. Unable to challenge American fighters directly, they shifted tactics toward hit-and-run attacks coordinated with surface-to-air missile sites. MiGs would make high-speed slashing attacks, force American formations to maneuver into SAM engagement envelopes, then escape, while ground-based missiles did the killing. The chess match had evolved to 3 dimensions. American pilots found themselves simultaneously fighting enemy aircraft, avoiding surface-to-air missiles, and coordinating with electronic warfare aircraft that jammed Vietnamese radar systems. Every mission became a complex orchestration of multiple aircraft types, each playing specific roles in an integrated air campaign. By August 1972, American kill ratios had improved to better than 5.1 against Vietnamese fighters. The technological advantages that had been promised in 1965 were finally being realized, but only after years of tactical evolution that taught American pilots how to employ their superior equipment within the constraints of actual combat conditions. The air wars over North Vietnam had become exactly what Pentagon planners originally envisioned, a demonstration of American technological superiority. But that demonstration required human skill, tactical innovation, and hard-won experience that no computer model could have predicted. The magic number was 5. 5 confirmed aerial victories would transform any pilot from anonymous warrior to celebrated ace, from military professional to national hero. By late 1972, American fighter crews were hunting those kills with an intensity that bordered on obsession, knowing that ace status meant magazine covers, book deals, and a permanent place in aviation history. Captain Steve Ritchie was leading the race with 4 confirmed MiG kills, each one a masterpiece of tactical execution that demonstrated how far American air combat had evolved since the dark days of 1965. His weapons systems officer, Captain Chuck de Bellevue, had been with him for 3 of those victories, the 2 men functioning as a perfectly coordinated team in the F-4's cramped cockpit. The competition wasn't just among Americans. North Vietnamese pilots were playing the same deadly game, with their own propaganda machines celebrating aces like Nguyen Van Cock and Pham Thanh Ngan. Vietnamese radio broadcasts taunted American pilots by name, promising special treatment for any ace who fell into their hands. The personal nature of the rivalry added psychological pressure to an already lethal profession. Captain Richard Ritchie, no relation to Steve despite the shared surname, was close behind with 3 confirmed kills and a reputation for aggressive tactics that worried his squadron commanders. He'd been known to pursue damaged MiGs deep into North Vietnamese airspace, ignoring fuel limitations and surface-to-air missile threats in his determination to claim that crucial 5th victory. The media attention was intoxicating and dangerous in equal measure. Life magazine photographers followed potential aces around their bases, documenting everything from pre-flight briefings to post-mission celebrations. Television crews broadcast live interviews from Thailand, turning fighter pilots into celebrities whose faces were recognized in American living rooms. But fame came with a price that went beyond the obvious combat risks. Ace candidates found themselves taking chances they might otherwise avoid, extending engagements when tactical wisdom suggested disengagement, pursuing kills when survival instincts counseled retreat. The psychological pressure to achieve that 5th victory corrupted tactical judgment in ways that got good pilots killed. Major Bob Lodge understood the temptation better than most. With 4 confirmed kills, he was tantalizingly close to ace status when his luck ran out over North Vietnam in May 1972. Pursuing what would have been his 5th victory, Lodge followed a damaged MiG-21 into a surface-to-air missile trap that cost him his life. His burning F-4 became a cautionary tale about the dangers of glory hunting. The North Vietnamese exploited American ace fever with characteristic cunning. They began using damaged fighters as bait, allowing them to appear vulnerable while positioning other MiGs for ambush attacks on pursuing Americans. Vietnamese controllers learned to recognize the radio chatter patterns that indicated ace candidates in their formations, then concentrated their defensive efforts accordingly. Chuck de Bellevue faced a unique challenge as a weapons systems officer rather than a pilot. His role in aerial victories was crucial, managing the radar, coordinating missile shots, maintaining situational awareness, but military regulations required pilots to receive primary credit for kills. De Bellevue was accumulating victories faster than anyone in the theater, but his contributions remained largely invisible to the public. The psychological warfare extended beyond individual rivalries. Both sides used ace pilots for propaganda purposes, broadcasting their exploits to boost home front morale while demoralizing enemy forces. American aces appeared on television talk shows, while North Vietnamese heroes were featured in Soviet military publications distributed throughout the Warsaw Pact. Captain Steve Ritchie finally achieved his fifth kill on August 28, 1972, becoming the first American pilot ace of the Vietnam War. His victory came during a perfectly executed beyond visual range intercept that demonstrated everything the F-4 Phantom was designed to accomplish. The AIM-7F Sparrow missile tracked flawlessly through clear air at 25,000 feet, destroying a MiG-21 that never saw the attack coming. The celebration was brief. Within hours, intelligence reports confirmed that North Vietnamese ace Nguyen Van Cook had also achieved his fifth victory, shooting down an F-4 Phantom during the same engagement that made Ritchie famous. The deadly mathematics of air combat meant that every American success was balanced by Vietnamese achievement. De Bellevue eventually became the highest-scoring American ace of Vietnam with 6 confirmed victories, though his achievements received less recognition due to his non-pilot status. His success proved that modern air combat was fundamentally a team effort, requiring coordination between multiple crew members operating increasingly complex weapon systems. The ace race revealed uncomfortable truths about how personal ambition could distort military effectiveness. Individual glory and tactical wisdom didn't always align, creating situations where the pursuit of fame endangered not just ace candidates, but their wingmen and entire formations. The most successful pilots learned to balance aggressive tactics with calculated risk management. The Wild Weasel F-4G Phantom looked different from its air-to-air cousins, bristling with antennas, radar warning receivers, and electronic countermeasures pods that turned the sleek fighter into a flying electronics laboratory. Its mission was equally unique: hunt down and destroy the surface-to-air missile sites that had turned North Vietnamese airspace into a deadly gauntlet for American bombers. Captain Gary Willard strapped into his Wild Weasel for what would become the most dangerous mission in aviation, deliberately flying into SAM engagement envelopes to provoke enemy radar operators into revealing their positions. First in, last out was the Wild Weasel motto, and it wasn't just bravado. These specialized F-4s led strike packages into target areas, then remained behind to suppress missile sites while bombers escaped. The electronic warfare revolution had begun quietly in 1965, when American intelligence officers noticed patterns in North Vietnamese radar emissions. SDA-2 guideline missile sites used distinctive radar signatures that could be detected, analyzed, and eventually jammed or destroyed. What started as passive intelligence gathering evolved into active electronic combat that added an entirely new dimension to air warfare. The APR-25 radar warning receiver transformed F-4 cockpits into electronic battlefields where pilots fought enemies they couldn't see with weapons that existed only as radio waves. Willard's scope displayed threat symbols that represented different types of enemy radars: search radars looking for targets, tracking radars following specific aircraft, and the dreaded missile guidance radars that meant death was already in the air. North Vietnamese operators adapted with characteristic ingenuity. They learned to turn their radars on and off in unpredictable patterns, denying American electronic warfare systems the steady signals they needed for precise location fixes. Some sites used optical guidance systems that were completely immune to electronic jamming. Others coordinated their attacks with MiG fighters, forcing American pilots to choose between evading missiles and defending against aircraft. The AGM-45 Shrike missile gave Wild Weasel crews their primary weapon, a radar homing projectile that could follow enemy emissions back to their source. But the Shrike had limitations that North Vietnamese operators exploited ruthlessly. The missile required continuous radar emissions to maintain guidance, so SAM sites simply turned off their radars after missile launch, causing Shrikes to lose track and crash harmlessly into empty jungle. Electronic warfare became a deadly game of cat and mouse, played at the speed of light. American jamming pods broadcast white noise across radar frequencies, creating electronic fog that blinded enemy operators. Vietnamese technicians responded by changing frequencies, using different radar modes, or coordinating multiple sites to burn through the jamming with concentrated power. The psychological pressure on Wild Weasel crews was enormous. They flew the most dangerous missions in the most heavily defended airspace in military history, knowing that every radar warning could be their last. The SA-2 missiles they hunted traveled at 3 times the speed of sound, giving pilots perhaps 10 seconds from launch detection to successful evasion. Captain Al Lamb discovered another dimension of electronic warfare during a mission over the Red River Valley. His radar warning receiver detected multiple SAM sites tracking his formation, but the signals seemed to be coming from impossible directions. North Vietnamese operators had learned to use radar reflectors and false transmitters, creating ghost signals that confused American electronic warfare systems and masked the locations of real threats. The arms race accelerated throughout 1972 as both sides developed increasingly sophisticated countermeasures. American aircraft carried ALQ-87 jamming pods that could automatically detect and jam multiple radar frequencies simultaneously. North Vietnamese sites responded with frequency-agile radars that changed characteristics faster than jamming systems could adapt. The revolution extended beyond individual aircraft to entire strike packages coordinated through electronic warfare. EB-66 electronic warfare aircraft provided standoff jamming, while Wild Weasels suppressed point defenses and fighter escorts maintained air superiority. Every major bombing mission became an orchestrated electronic symphony where success depended on perfect coordination between multiple specialized platforms. By late 1972, electronic warfare had become as important as traditional air-to-air combat in determining mission success. The invisible battle fought with radio waves and computer algorithms would define military aviation for the next 50 years, proving that future wars would be won as much in the electromagnetic spectrum as in physical space. Captain Paul Gilmore's parachute drifted toward the jungle canopy 30 miles northwest of Hanoi. His F-4 Phantom, a smoking crater somewhere behind him. Below, North Vietnamese militia were already moving toward his landing site, their shouts echoing through the morning mist. In 20 minutes, he would begin a 7-year journey through the hell that American prisoners called the Hanoi Hilton. The human cost of the air war extended far beyond the sterile statistics tracked in Pentagon briefing rooms. Every F-4 shot down represented 2 American lives, pilot and weapon systems officer, thrust into a nightmare of captivity, torture, and psychological warfare that would scar them permanently. The North Vietnamese understood that captured airmen were valuable propaganda weapons, living proof that American technological superiority was a myth. Lieutenant Colonel Robinson Rissner had been a prisoner for 3 years when Gilmore arrived at Ho Lo Prison, his spirit broken by endless interrogation sessions and solitary confinement in concrete cells barely large enough for a human body. The Vietnamese used captured pilots to demonstrate their victory over American imperialism, parading broken men before international journalists as evidence of their moral superiority. But the human cost wasn't limited to Americans. North Vietnamese pilot Nguyen Van Bay was 19 years old when his MiG-17 disintegrated under 20 mm cannon fire from an F-4's gun pod. His mother received a telegram informing her that her son had died a hero's death defending the homeland, but no telegram could explain why such a young man had to die in the first place. The families waiting at home carried their own invisible wounds. Sharon Ritchie spent sleepless nights listening to radio. Broadcasts from Hanoi, hoping to hear her husband's name among the prisoners, but dreading the confirmation that he'd been shot down. The wives of missing airmen existed in a limbo of uncertainty, not knowing whether their husbands were dead, captured, or hiding in the jungle waiting for rescue. Vietnamese families faced similar anguish. Le Thi Thu watched her son, Vam Thanh Chung, climb into his MiG-21 for the last time, knowing that American missiles had claimed 3 of his squadron mates in the past month. The mathematics of air combat were brutally simple. Every mission reduced the odds of survival, and every pilot understood that death was not a possibility, but an inevitability. The psychological warfare was deliberately cruel. North Vietnamese interrogators used captured American pilots to record propaganda broadcasts, their voices hollow with exhaustion as they read statements condemning their own country's involvement in Vietnam. These recordings were played on radio frequencies monitored by American forces, forcing other pilots to listen to their comrades' degradation. American rescue operations added another layer of human tragedy. When Captain Bob Wilson's F-4 was shot down near the DMZ, 6 different aircraft were damaged or destroyed in attempts to recover him and his weapons systems officer. The dedication to leaving no man behind was admirable, but it multiplied casualties in ways that made tactical sense but human heartbreak. The torture techniques used in North Vietnamese prisons were designed to break men's spirits rather than extract military information. Prisoners were forced into stress positions for hours, denied medical care for infected wounds, and subjected to psychological pressure that drove some to attempt suicide. The Geneva Convention was treated as a meaningless document by captors who viewed American airmen as war criminals. Major James Kassler survived 4 years of captivity by developing mental exercises that kept his sanity intact, memorizing poetry, solving mathematical problems in his head, and maintaining military discipline even in solitary confinement. His survival techniques became legendary among prisoners, passed through tap codes on cell walls from one captured airman to another. The Vietnamese pilots who survived faced their own psychological challenges. Captain Pham Thanh Nguyen had shot down 4 American aircraft when his own MiG-21 was destroyed by a Sidewinder missile. He spent 6 months in a military hospital recovering from burns that covered 40% of his body. His flying career ended, but his life spared by American pilots who could have killed him. The human cost of technological warfare was measured not just in lives lost, but in spirits broken, families destroyed, and young men aged beyond their years by experiences that no training could prepare them for. Every missile fired, every aircraft shot down, every pilot captured represented individual tragedies that statistics could never adequately capture. The red telephone in Admiral John McCain's Saigon office rang at 300 hours with news that would define the next phase of America's air war over Vietnam. A Navy F-4 Phantom had just shot down a MiG-17 over international waters, technically a victory, but the enemy fighter had been fleeing toward Chinese airspace when the Sidewinder missile found its target. Within hours, Beijing would lodge formal protests, claiming the engagement violated their territorial sovereignty. The rules of engagement that governed American air operations over Vietnam were written by lawyers, not fighter pilots. Every missile shot required split-second decisions about international law, political consequences, and tactical necessity. Pilots found themselves hesitating at crucial moments, calculating diplomatic ramifications while enemy fighters maneuvered for killing shots. The buffer zones were the most frustrating restrictions. North Vietnamese airfields at PhuIen and Gia Lam were protected by invisible boundaries that American pilots couldn't cross, even when pursuing damaged enemy fighters. MiG pilots learned to exploit these sanctuaries ruthlessly, engaging American formations, then racing for the safety of politically protected airspace where pursuit was forbidden. Captain Steve Ritchie watched helplessly as a damaged MiG-21 limped toward the Chinese border, its pilot bleeding from shrapnel wounds, but still alive because international politics mattered more than tactical advantage. "We had him cold," Ritchie radioed to his controller. "Permission to pursue." The response was always the same. Negative. "Do not cross the buffer zone." The visual identification requirement created deadly tactical dilemmas. American radar could detect and track enemy fighters from 50 miles away, but rules of engagement prohibited missile shots until pilots confirmed their targets were actually hostile aircraft. This meant closing to within a few miles of enemy fighters, exactly the range where North Vietnamese advantages in turning performance became decisive. Vietnamese controllers understood these restrictions better than American pilots did. They positioned their fighters just inside buffer zones, forcing Americans to choose between tactical advantage and political compliance. MiG pilots would fly lazy circles just beyond the engagement boundary, taunting American formations that couldn't respond without violating orders. The hot pursuit doctrine was equally problematic. American fighters could chase enemy aircraft across the DMZs into North Vietnamese airspace, but only if they maintained continuous visual contact. Break that contact for even a few seconds, and the engagement had to be terminated regardless of tactical situation. Vietnamese pilots used clouds, ground clutter, and terrain masking to exploit this loophole. Colonel Robin Olds discovered another absurdity during a mission over the Red River Valley. His formation had detected multiple MiG contacts on radar, but the rules required each target to be visually identified before engagement. By the time his pilots completed the identification process, the Vietnamese fighters had positioned themselves for perfect intercepts. Legal compliance was getting Americans killed. The most dangerous restriction involved pursuit into Chinese airspace. North Vietnamese fighters would engage American formations, then flee across the border, knowing that political considerations protected them from retaliation. Chinese air defense systems were coordinated with Vietnamese operations, creating a sanctuary where enemy pilots could rearm, refuel, and return to combat without fear of American interference. Intelligence officers estimated that 40% of North Vietnamese air operations originated from Chinese bases, but American pilots were forbidden from attacking these facilities or pursuing enemy aircraft that used them. The tactical absurdity was obvious to everyone except the politicians who wrote the rules. Admiral McCain finally exploded during a Pentagon briefing in late 1972. "We're asking our pilots to fight with one hand tied behind their backs while the enemy uses every advantage available to them. These rules of engagement aren't protecting civilians, they're protecting enemy fighters who are killing Americans." The restrictions created a fundamental asymmetry that North Vietnamese commanders exploited with characteristic intelligence. They understood that American political constraints were more limiting than technological disadvantages, so they designed their entire air defense strategy around forcing Americans to operate within these artificial boundaries. The rules meant to prevent escalation were actually prolonging the conflict by denying American forces the tactical flexibility needed for decisive victory. The Soviet transport aircraft touched down at Noi Bai airfield outside Hanoi in the pre-dawn darkness of March 1973. Its cargo hold filled with wooden crates marked only with Cyrillic letters and red stars. Inside those crates were MiG-21B's fighters, the most advanced interceptors in the Soviet inventory, equipped with radar systems and missile technology that had never been exported to any Warsaw Pact ally. General Vo Nguyen Giap personally supervised the unloading, understanding that these aircraft represented more than military hardware. They were Moscow's commitment to matching every American technological advantage with Soviet innovation. The arms race that had begun with simple MiG-17s facing missile-armed Phantoms had evolved into a competition between superpowers using Vietnamese skies as their testing ground. The MiG-21B's carried the R-13M missile, a heat-seeking weapon with all-aspect capability that could engage targets from any angle, not just from behind like earlier infrared missiles. More importantly, the new fighters mounted improved radar systems that could track multiple targets simultaneously while remaining difficult for American electronic warfare systems to detect and jam. American intelligence officers at the Pentagon were analyzing captured MiG components with growing concern. The technological gap that had given F-4 Phantoms their decisive advantage during Operation Bolo was closing rapidly. Soviet engineers had been studying every American innovation, developing countermeasures that neutralized hard-won tactical advantages. The F-4E Phantom represented America's response to this technological leapfrog. The new variant mounted an internal M61 cannon that eliminated the accuracy and vibration problems of external gun pods. More significantly, it carried the APG-66 radar system, a quantum leap in target detection and tracking capability that could burn through most Soviet jamming systems. But the most important American innovation was the AIM-9L Sidewinder, a missile so advanced that its capabilities were classified at levels normally reserved for nuclear weapons. The new Sidewinder could engage targets from any aspect, track through violent evasive maneuvers, and resist the infrared countermeasures that had protected earlier generations of enemy fighters. Captain Chuck Horner, testing the new systems at Nellis Air Force Base, was amazed by the technological transformation. "This isn't the same aircraft we were flying 3 years ago," he reported to his squadron commander. "The radar can track 12 targets simultaneously, the missiles can kill from any angle, and the gun actually hits what you're aiming at." The intelligence war had become as important as the shooting war. Both sides were desperately trying to capture examples of enemy technology for analysis and reverse engineering. When a MiG-21B's force landed at a Thai airfield after its pilot became disoriented, American technicians swarmed over the aircraft like archaeologists examining an ancient artifact. The technological leapfrog extended beyond individual weapons to entire systems integration. American strike packages now employed dedicated electronic warfare aircraft, airborne early warning systems, and air-to-air refueling that created sustained combat capability far from friendly bases. The North Vietnamese responded with integrated air defense networks that coordinated fighters, surface-to-air missiles, and anti-aircraft guns through centralized command systems. Soviet advisors were studying American tactics with the same intensity their Vietnamese allies had applied to learning F-4 capabilities. Every engagement was analyzed, every American innovation was countered, every tactical advantage was neutralized through technological adaptation. The lessons learned in Vietnamese skies would influence Soviet fighter design for the next 2 decades. The feedback loop between combat experience and weapons development had accelerated dramatically. Missiles that failed in combat were redesigned within months rather than years. Electronic warfare systems were updated continuously based on enemy countermeasures encountered during actual missions. The traditional peacetime development cycle of decades had compressed into combat cycles measured in weeks. American pilots found themselves flying aircraft that were constantly evolving, with new systems and capabilities appearing faster than training programs could accommodate them. The F-4 Phantom of 1975 shared only basic airframe design with the aircraft that had entered combat in 1965. Everything else, radar, missiles, guns, electronic systems, had been transformed by the crucible of Vietnamese combat. The technological arms race had created a paradox that neither side fully understood. Each innovation designed to provide decisive advantage was quickly countered by enemy adaptation, creating an endless cycle of development that consumed enormous resources while producing only temporary tactical benefits. The real winners were the defense contractors and research institutions that profited from this perpetual competition. The F-105 Thunderchief was never designed to be a fighter. Republic Aviation had built the massive single-seat aircraft as a nuclear strike bomber, capable of carrying a single atomic weapon deep into Soviet territory at supersonic speeds. But in the skies over North Vietnam, Thuds found themselves flying daily bombing missions into the most heavily defended airspace in military history, depending on F-4 Phantom escorts to keep them alive. Major Jack Broughton led his flight of 8 F-105s toward the Yen Vien rail yard at 800 hours. their bomb bays loaded with 3,000-pound payloads that would crater the switching facilities feeding supplies toward South Vietnam. 20 miles behind, Colonel Robin Old's F-4 formation maintained protective altitude, scanning for the MiG interceptors that intelligence predicted would challenge the strike package. The geography of North Vietnam created natural choke points that Vietnamese defenders exploited ruthlessly. Thud Ridge, a mountain range northwest of Hanoi, forced American bombing formations into predictable flight paths that enemy controllers could anticipate hours in advance. MiG-17s and MiG-21s positioned themselves along these corridors, timing their attacks for maximum effectiveness against the vulnerable strike aircraft. Communication between different aircraft types created constant problems that Vietnamese pilots learned to exploit. F-105s used UHF radio frequencies for tactical coordination, while F-4 escorts operated on VHF channels for air-to-air combat. During the chaos of simultaneous bombing runs and fighter engagements, critical warnings often failed to reach the pilots who needed them most. Captain Pete Foley, flying F-4 escort, watched his radar scope fill with enemy contacts as MiG-21s climbed from Phuc Yen airfield. "Bandits, 12 o'clock high, coming down fast," he radioed to the strike formation. But his transmission went to other F-4s on the Eagsdale air-to-air frequency. The F-105 pilots never heard the warning that could have saved their lives. The first MiG attack came from above and behind, classic tactics that exploited the Thunder Chief's limited rear visibility and defensive armament. Captain Nguyen Van Kock rolled his MiG-21 into a high-speed dive, his 23mm cannon stitching a line of destruction across the lead F-105's wing route. Major Broughton's aircraft exploded in a fireball that lit up the morning sky, taking with it years of tactical experience and irreplaceable pilot training. F-4 escorts found themselves fighting a three-dimensional battle that stretched their capabilities beyond design limits. They had to maintain formation integrity with the slower F-105s, while simultaneously engaging enemy fighters that could appear from any direction. The tactical coordination required split-second timing that left no margin for error or miscommunication. The bombing mission continued despite the fighter attacks, F-105 pilots maintaining their attack runs even as MiGs slashed through their formations. This dedication to mission completion was both admirable and tragic. American pilots died delivering bombs to targets that were often rebuilt within days of destruction. The tactical success was undeniable, but the strategic impact remained questionable. Vietnamese ground controllers coordinated the attacks with sophisticated timing that maximized American losses. MiG-17s would engage the F-4 escorts in turning fights that neutralized their missile advantages, while MiG-21s made high-speed attacks on the F-105 formations. The two-pronged assault divided American defensive efforts and created opportunities for devastating losses. Captain Bob Pardo discovered another dimension of the coordination problem during a mission over the Red River Valley. His F-4 was providing close escort for F-105s when MiG-17s attacked from below, forcing him into a defensive engagement. While he fought for his life against the nimble Vietnamese fighters, MiG-21s attacked the unprotected strike aircraft from a different direction. The tactical dilemma was unsolvable. He couldn't be in two places simultaneously. The lessons learned over Thud Ridge would reshape American tactical doctrine for decades. The importance of integrated communications, coordinated defensive tactics, and realistic training became obvious through the blood of pilots who died learning these truths in combat. The price of tactical education was measured in burning aircraft scattered across the Vietnamese jungle. By late 1967, the coordination between F-4 escorts and F-105 strike aircraft had improved dramatically. But the fundamental vulnerability remained. Heavily loaded bombers flying predictable routes would always be vulnerable to fighter attack, regardless of escort effectiveness. The solution required either different tactics or different aircraft, preferably both. The radio crackled with desperation at 13:47 hours. "Mayday, Mayday, this is Falcon 2-1 going down northwest of Hanoi. Pilot and backseater ejecting. Captain Bill Henderson's F-4 Phantom had taken a direct hit from a SA-2 surface-to-air missile, and now 2 American airmen were descending toward the most heavily defended territory in North Vietnam under silk parachutes that made them visible for miles. Within minutes, the largest rescue operation of the war was spinning up at bases across Thailand and South Vietnam. HH-53 Super Jolly Green Giant helicopters began their engines, while A-1 Skyraider Sandy aircraft prepared for the most dangerous mission in military aviation, flying low and slow over hostile territory to recover downed airmen who might already be surrounded by enemy forces. The mathematics of rescue operations were brutal and unforgiving. Every downed crew member was worth risking multiple aircraft and dozens of additional lives, not just for humanitarian reasons, but for the psychological impact on surviving airmen. Pilots who knew their comrades would move heaven and earth to retrieve them fought with a determination that couldn't be measured in tactical manuals. Colonel Robin Olds coordinated the rescue from his F-4, establishing a protective cap over the crash site, while Sandy aircraft began their dangerous descent toward the jungle canopy. "We got 2 good shoots on the ground," reported Sandy Led, "but there's movement in the trees. Looks like a search party heading their way." The race was on between American rescue forces and North Vietnamese militia. The A-1 Skyraiders were perfect for rescue missions and completely wrong for the modern battlefield. These propeller-driven relics from World War II could loiter for hours above downed airmen, providing close air support with machine guns and rockets that could be delivered with surgical precision. But their slow speed made them sitting ducks for any MiG pilot who spotted them. Captain Tom Curtis dove his Sandy aircraft toward the jungle floor, his radial engine roaring as he searched for the downed F-4 crew. Below, Henderson and his weapons systems officer were hiding in bamboo thickets while North Vietnamese soldiers closed in from 3 directions. The rescue had to happen within the next few minutes, or it wouldn't happen at all. The HH-53 rescue helicopter arrived like a mechanical angel, its twin turbine engines creating a hurricane of rotor wash that flattened the vegetation around the crash site. But the helicopter was completely defenseless during the pickup, requiring Sandy aircraft to suppress any enemy forces that might engage during the vulnerable hover. Rescue crews called this the golden hour, the brief window when speed mattered more than stealth. Vietnamese forces understood the American commitment to rescue operations and exploited it ruthlessly. They learned to position anti-aircraft guns around likely crash sites, turning rescue attempts into elaborate traps that could destroy multiple aircraft. Some downed American airmen became unwilling bait in deadly games that cost more lives than they saved. Major Dick Rutan watched in horror as a SA-2 missile tracked toward the rescue helicopter, its radar guidance system locked onto the large, slow-moving target. The HH-53 had no defensive systems, no electronic countermeasures, no way to evade a weapon designed to destroy supersonic fighters. The missile impact turned the helicopter into a fireball that killed 6 rescuers attempting to save 2 downed airmen. But when rescues succeeded, they created legends that inspired entire generations of military aviators. Staff Sergeant William Pitzenbarger descended from his rescue helicopter into a firefight to save wounded soldiers, staying on the ground to treat casualties even after his aircraft was forced to withdraw. His Medal of Honor citation became required reading for every rescue crew member. The psychological impact extended beyond individual operations. North Vietnamese propaganda broadcasts featured captured American pilots describing the futility of American rescue attempts. But these force statements had the opposite effect. Hearing their comrades' voices, even under duress, reminded surviving airmen that capture wasn't necessarily permanent and that their country hadn't abandoned them. The rescue commitment came at enormous cost: aircraft, fuel, ammunition, and most importantly, the lives of men who volunteered for the most dangerous missions in military aviation. But it also created an esprit de corps that made American pilots more effective in combat, knowing that their brothers in arms would risk everything to bring them home. The AIM-9L Sidewinder that rolled off the production line at China Lake Naval Weapons Center in January 1973 looked almost identical to the missiles that had failed so spectacularly during the early years of Vietnam. Same white body, same distinctive canard fins, same infrared seeker head. But inside that familiar exterior, a revolution in guidance technology was about to transform air combat forever. Engineer Ron Westrom had spent 4 years analyzing combat failure reports from Southeast Asia. His desk covered with after-action reports describing missiles that lost track in clouds, chased the sun instead of enemy aircraft, or simply exploded prematurely without hitting anything. Each failure represented not just wasted ordnance, but American lives lost to technological inadequacy. The original AIM-9B Sidewinder could only engage targets from directly behind, where aircraft exhaust provided the heat signature necessary for missile guidance. Enemy pilots quickly learned to exploit this limitation, turning toward attacking aircraft to present their cool frontal aspects where early infrared seekers couldn't maintain lock. The tactical implications were devastating. American fighters had to maneuver behind their targets before shooting, exactly where enemy defensive advantages were strongest. The Sturm AIM-9D variant introduced during 1967 improved reliability significantly, but still required rear aspect engagements that forced American pilots into disadvantageous tactical positions. Vietnamese MiG pilots became expert at exploiting these limitations, using violent turning maneuvers to break missile lock or simply flying toward the sun, where primitive seekers would lose track completely. But the AIM-9L represented a quantum leap in missile technology. Its new seeker head could detect and track aircraft from any angle, front, side, or rear, using advanced infrared sensors that could distinguish between aircraft heat signatures and background thermal noise. More importantly, the improved guidance system could maintain lock through violent evasive maneuvers that would have defeated earlier missiles completely. The technical breakthrough came from solid-state electronics that replaced the vacuum tubes and mechanical systems of earlier missiles. These new components functioned reliably in the humidity, temperature extremes, and vibration that had caused so many failures in tropical combat conditions. The mean time between failures improved from hours to months, transforming missiles from temperamental experimental weapons into reliable combat tools. Captain Steve Ritchie was among the first pilots to receive AIM-9L missiles for combat testing, and the difference was immediately apparent. The new Sidewinders track like they're connected to the target with invisible wire, he reported after his first engagement. The MiG pilot tried every defensive maneuver in the book, but the missile stayed locked through turns that would have broken earlier seekers. The AIM-7F Sparrow underwent similar technological evolution, with solid-state guidance systems replacing the unreliable electronics that had plagued earlier variants. The new missiles could track targets at longer ranges, function in electronic jamming environments, and maintain guidance through the violent maneuvers that characterized modern air combat. Vietnamese pilots noticed the change immediately. Colonel Toom, now commanding North Vietnam's most experienced fighter regiment, briefed his pilots on the new threat. The American missiles no longer lose track when you turn toward them. They follow you through any maneuver, and they can kill from any angle. We must adapt our tactics, or we will all die. The reliability improvements were just as important as capability enhancements. Combat reports from 1973 showed missile success rates approaching 80% under optimal conditions, a dramatic improvement from the 20% reliability that had characterized early Vietnam engagements. American pilots could finally trust their weapons to function as advertised. The missile evolution represented more than technological progress. It validated the original vision of beyond visual range air combat that Pentagon planners had promoted in 1965. The concept had been correct, but this technology needed 8 years of combat development to match the theoretical capabilities that had been promised from the beginning. These improved missiles would define air combat for the next 50 years, proving that patience and persistence could overcome initial technological failures. The lessons learned in Vietnamese skies had finally produced weapons worthy of the pilots who risked their lives employing them. December 18, 1972, the largest air battle since World War II was about to unfold over North Vietnam as President Nixon unleashed Operation Linebacker II, the Christmas bombings that would bring the war to its climactic conclusion. B-52 Stratofortresses, the massive 8-engine bombers that had never faced serious fighter opposition, were finally heading toward Hanoi in formations that would test every lesson learned during 8 years of air combat evolution. Captain Steve Ritchie climbed his F-4E Phantom toward 35,000 feet, leading a fighter sweep ahead of the bomber formations. His aircraft carried the latest AIM-9L Sidewinders and AIM-7F Sparrows, missiles that represented the culmination of technological development driven by years of combat failure and adaptation. This time, American air power would demonstrate the full potential that had been promised but never delivered during the early years of Vietnam. The North Vietnamese response was immediate and massive. Every operational MiG-21 in their inventory scrambled from airfields around Hanoi, their pilots understanding that this was their final opportunity to inflict decisive losses on American air power. Colonel Nguyen Van Kock, now commanding the elite 921st Fighter Regiment, personally led the intercept mission that would determine whether Vietnamese air defenses could survive the American onslaught. The first engagement erupted at 09:47 hours, when 16 MiG-21s climbed toward the B-52 formations, their pilots hoping to repeat the tactics that had worked against smaller strike packages. But they found themselves facing F-4 escorts that had finally learned to use their technological advantages properly. The improved missiles tracked flawlessly through defensive maneuvers that would have defeated earlier weapons completely. Captain Richard Ritchie's AIM-7F Sparrow destroyed a MiG-21 at 40 miles range, the kind of beyond visual range kill that Pentagon planners had envisioned in 1965 but couldn't achieve until 1972. The Vietnamese pilot never saw the missile coming, never had a chance to employ the defensive tactics that had saved so many of his comrades during earlier engagements. The technological balance had shifted decisively in America's favor. The aerial battles that followed were unlike anything seen during the previous years of conflict. American fighters engaged multiple targets simultaneously, their improved radar systems tracking dozens of enemy aircraft while coordinating missile shots with a precision that overwhelmed Vietnamese defensive capabilities. The kill ratios that had favored North Vietnam during 1965 were completely reversed by 1972. Major Bob Lodge's replacement, Captain John Madden, led his flight against a formation of MiG-17s attempting to attack the B-52s from below. The older Vietnamese fighters, which had dominated American F-4s during the early war years, found themselves helpless against pilots who had finally learned to exploit their aircraft's superior speed and altitude performance. The turning fights that had once favored Vietnamese pilots became death traps when American fighters refused to be drawn into disadvantageous engagements. The psychological impact was devastating for North Vietnamese pilots who had grown accustomed to tactical parity despite their technological disadvantages. Captain Pham Thanh Nguyen, one of Vietnam's leading aces, watched 3 of his wingmen die in a single engagement, their MiG-21s destroyed by missiles that seemed to anticipate every evasive maneuver. The confidence that had sustained Vietnamese air operations for 7 years cracked under the weight of technological superiority finally realized. The B-52 formations pressed their attacks despite surface-to-air missile barrages that filled the sky with deadly explosions. The strategic bombers that had been designed to deliver nuclear weapons against Soviet targets proved equally effective at destroying the industrial infrastructure that sustained North Vietnam's war effort. Hanoi's power plants, rail yards, and military installations disappeared under cascades of conventional bombs delivered with unprecedented precision. By December 30th, the North Vietnamese Air Force had effectively ceased to exist as a fighting force. Their remaining aircraft were grounded for lack of fuel, spare parts, and qualified pilots. The airfields that had launched thousands of sorties against American formations sat empty, their runways cratered by B-52 attacks that continued around the clock. The final air battle of the Vietnam War occurred on January 8, 1973, when two MiG-21s attempted to intercept a reconnaissance flight over the Red River Valley. Both Vietnamese fighters were destroyed by AIM-9L Sidewinder missiles that tracked perfectly through defensive maneuvers, marking the end of an air campaign that had cost both sides hundreds of aircraft and thousands of lives. American air superiority was finally complete, but victory came only after years of tactical evolution that had transformed both aircraft and the men who flew them. The F-4 Phantom that rolled off McDonnell Douglas production lines in 1975 bore little resemblance to the aircraft that had first entered Vietnamese skies a decade earlier. Same basic airframe, same twin engines, same two-man crew, but everything else had been transformed by the crucible of combat experience that no peacetime testing could have provided. The missile-only philosophy that had seemed so logical in Pentagon briefing rooms lay shattered in the wake jungles of Southeast Asia, buried alongside the pilots who had died, learning that technological superiority meant nothing without tactical wisdom. The arrogance that had dismissed dogfighting as obsolete had cost hundreds of American lives before reality forced a fundamental reassessment of air combat doctrine. General John Meyer, now commanding Tactical Air Command, addressed the Air War College in 1974 with brutal honesty about the lessons learned through blood and failure. We sent our best pilots to war with weapons that didn't work, tactics that were wrong, and a philosophy that ignored everything we should have known about combat. The miracle isn't that we eventually succeeded. It's that we survived our own stupidity long enough to learn. The training revolution that emerged from Vietnam's ashes would reshape military aviation for generations. The Navy's Top Gun program, born from the humiliation of early missile failures, created a new breed of fighter pilot who understood that technology was only as effective as the human beings who employed it. Realistic combat training replaced theoretical classroom instruction, with pilots learning to fight against aircraft that replicated enemy capabilities and tactics. The Air Force's Red Flag exercises at Nellis Air Force Base became the premier training ground for air combat, where American pilots faced simulated Soviet tactics flown by instructors who had studied every North Vietnamese innovation. The lessons learned over Hanoi and Haiphong were institutionalized into training programs that ensured future generations wouldn't repeat the same deadly mistakes. But the most important lesson was philosophical rather than tactical. The belief that advanced technology could substitute for combat experience had proven catastrophically wrong. Missiles were tools, not magic weapons. Radar was helpful, not infallible. Electronic systems were aids, not replacements for pilot skill and tactical judgment. The human element remained decisive in determining victory or defeat. The missile technology that had failed so spectacularly in 1965 finally matured into reliable weapons by 1973, but only after years of combat testing that cost more lives than any peacetime development program could justify. The AIM-9L Sidewinder and AIM-7F Sparrow that emerged from this bloody evolution would define air combat effectiveness for the next 50 years, proving that persistence could overcome initial technological failures. The North Vietnamese had taught Americans uncomfortable truths about the limitations of technological superiority. Small, agile fighters flown by determined pilots could challenge the most advanced aircraft in the world if they exploited tactical advantages intelligently. Training, motivation, and tactical innovation could offset technological disadvantages, at least temporarily. The David versus Goliath narrative had played out in Vietnamese skies with results that surprised both sides. The strategic implications extended far beyond individual air battles. American air power had eventually achieved complete superiority over North Vietnam. but only after years of adaptation that revealed fundamental flaws in military planning and procurement. The assumption that future wars would be brief, technological conflicts had proven dangerously naive when confronted with an enemy willing to absorb enormous casualties while learning to exploit American weaknesses. The rules of engagement that had constrained American operations throughout the conflict highlighted the tension between military effectiveness and political objectives. Technological superiority meant nothing when political considerations prevented its full employment. The most advanced fighters in the world couldn't achieve decisive results when forced to operate within artificial constraints that the enemy exploited ruthlessly. The human cost of these lessons couldn't be measured in dollars or aircraft production numbers. Hundreds of American airmen had died learning truths that should have been obvious before the first F-4 crossed into North Vietnamese airspace. Their sacrifice created the tactical doctrine, training programs, and weapon systems that would serve American air power for decades. But the price paid for that knowledge remained a permanent reminder of the dangers of military overconfidence. The legacy of Vietnam's air war lived on in every fighter squadron, every missile design, every training exercise that prepared American pilots for future conflicts. The phantom that North Vietnamese pilots had once mocked had become their nightmare, but only after American arrogance met Vietnamese cunning in the deadliest classroom imaginable. The phantom that North Vietnamese pilots once mocked became their nightmare, but only after American arrogance met Vietnamese cunning in the deadliest classroom imaginable. Those missiles that failed so spectacularly in 1965 would define air combat for the next 50 years. Want to see how these lessons shape the next generation of fighter aircraft? Check out our deep dive into the F-15 Eagle's development.